also want to make sure our length is on 4. Before we sew, I want to mention that it's best to have an open toe footer, and you also want to make sure that you constantly keep the tracks in parallel form. Made a lane and niggas can't get over. I can't mess with rappers, they be voting. Rather get the pack and keep it over. Big dripper stand up in the ocean. Everybody trapping, we get lost. He ain't focused yet. Hello, in this video we're going to be using a Singer heavy duty sewing machine. You want to make sure your pattern is on zigzag, and we also want to make sure our length is on 4. So now we're going to go ahead and remove our bundles from the packaging. So now we're going to put both ends together and line them up in parallel form. And before we sew, I want to mention that it's best to have an open toe footer so you can see your tracks. I got mine from Amazon. It's only maybe a couple bucks, $7 or $8. All right, so once your tracks are lined up right beside each other, you're going to slide them up under the open toe footer, but we're not going to put the end of the tracks at the very tip of the footer. We're going to actually put the end behind it and then put the footer down, just like that. Now you also would want to make sure all the hair is from up under the tracks before you begin to sew. And one reason why I actually don't put the tracks at the very end is because of this reason right here. I'm back stitching. So the back stitch is going to make sure it closes those ends together. But I realize when you start on the very tip, it's hard to catch that first sew. So I always put it a little bit past it, and the back stitch allows it to be sewn. And I do back stitch maybe 2 or 3 times, but I don't overdo it because you have to remember we're going to sew it on the cap, so that's going to be more thread, and you don't want the thread really bulky. Now it is very important to constantly check just to make sure there's no hair along the top where the track is. And you also want to make sure that you constantly keep the tracks in parallel form right beside each other, not directly on top of each other. Once you learn the technique, the process is much faster. Now once you get to the end, you would cut it, because if you don't cut it, to me it's going to be a little bulky. So I always cut the ends, make sure they still stay parallel form, and complete the sew. Once done, you want to make sure you cut off the excessive thread that's on the end. So we now officially have a double track. You want to check just to make sure everything is good. There's no hair inside of the thread on the weft, and they are not directly on top of each other. You can see both tracks, and it doesn't have to be perfectly straight. I like my tracks very straight and neat, but when you first start out doing them, they do not have to be super straight. So now we're going to begin sewing our third track on. So first you want to begin by making sure both pieces of thread is to the back or away from you. And then once you put your previous track down, the double track, your new one is going to go along the side of it, but not directly on top of it. And again, make sure the end is behind the footer, because we're going to back stitch it just like that. We're going to back stitch it close. So always make sure that end part is behind the footer when you start. And at that point there, I adjusted it just to make sure it's gonna sew evenly. And when you place your tracks behind the footer, it's only gonna be about 1/4 of an inch behind it when you start. This is another reason why it's great to have an open footer, because you can actually see your tracks and where you're sewing. And you always want to make sure there is no hair up underneath the track. And as you can see, I constantly check just to make sure there isn't any hair up under the tracks. So now that we reached the end, it's going to be the same procedure with cutting the weft or track and sewing the final back stitching. So now, after cutting off the excessive thread, we now have triple wefts or tracks. And if you look closely, you can see how they're all three laying amongst each other. I'm gonna freeze it again one more time so you can see 1, 2, 3. That's how the back should look. And there you have it, triple tracks. I hope this video was very helpful, and thank you so much for shopping with One Sexy Angel.
For the flight, nigga can't even see me on way out of here, I'm too far in the sky. Heard me, it's ash for the dark, my ash. Bitch so pretty, look better than